All right. We have Rosine in her tortilla blanket.
I will read the verse. Samuel 2:30. Let me find it.
1 Samuel 2:30. Should have it memorized by now.
Let me see. But now the Lord declares, those who honor me, I will honor them, and those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed.
And that was the verse that he had written down in his pocket when he did the race. Nice. Okay, chapter 6, local hero. Eric Liddell.
Greater than gold.
Chapter 6. Eric peered out the train window. The train was approaching Victoria Station. Soon the members of the 1924 British Olympic team would separate and go their own ways. Eric would be returning to Edinburgh, where he was due to graduate from university the following Saturday. As the train pulled slowly into the station, people ran along the platform from carriage to carriage, looking in the windows. "He's in here!" yelled a teenage boy as he pointed at Eric. Soon a mob of people was gathered outside the carriage Eric that was riding in. It's a misprint. Carriage that Eric was riding in. The crowd began cheering, "We want Eric! We want Eric!" As Eric gingerly opened the carriage door. A flood of cheers greeted him. Several of the men in the crowd. What?
Did you do the chickens?
I did do the chickens. I told Baba you close the chickens in.
But I didn't.
Rosie didn't put the chickens away. Tuck them into bed.
Fine.
Eric grabbed him. Sorry. Several of the men in the crowd grabbed him. He felt himself being hoisted onto their shoulders. The crowd went wild, cheering as Eric was paraded around the platform. Finally, things died down enough for Eric to make his way to a friend's home to stay the night. The following day, Eric set off for Edinburgh. It was not an easy trip. People everywhere recognized him. Young boys would thrust autographed books at him, and old men wanted to shake his hand or slap him on the back. Even though Eric was shy by nature, he did not mind the attention too much. He realized he had won his medals for the people of the British Isles. Now, these people wanted to congratulate him. Still, he was glad when he finally arrived home in Edinburgh. The following Saturday, Eric donned his black robe with his wide hood, ready to receive his Bachelor of Science degree. Scottish graduates wear a hood, not a mortarboard, as do the graduating students in many other countries. Eric took his place in alphabetical order in the front row of McEwen Hall, where the graduation ceremony was to take place. He listened closely as Vice Chancellor Sir Alfred Ewing gave the commencement address. Then, one by one, the graduating students were called up to receive their degrees. The audience applauded each student. They got the L's first, Lambert, G.H., then Lemon, F.M., and finally Liddell, E.H. As Eric stood, so did everyone else in McEwen Hall. The crowd cheered and clapped as Eric stepped onto the stage. Sir Alfred Ewing raised his hand, motioning the crowd to be quiet. But no one took the slightest notice of him. The people cheered and clapped and stomped their feet for several minutes before quieting down enough for the Vice-Chancellor to make a short speech. The speech was even shorter than he had planned. Sir Alfred Ewing barely had time to say, "Well, Mr. Liddell, you have shown that no one can pass you by but the examiner," when the applause erupted again. A full minute later, the crowd again quieted down and Sir Alfred Ewing was able to go on. He explained how, in the ancient Olympics, the champions were crowned with wreaths made from laurel leaves. As he spoke, he reached under the podium and pulled out a wreath. "Now, I was not able to obtain Greek laurel leaves here in Scotland, but the head gardener at the Royal Botanical Gardens assures me this is as close as we will find." With that, he placed the wreath firmly on Eric's head. Then the Greek master, who was also on stage, stepped forward and began to read a poem that he had written about Eric's victory. The poem was in ancient Greek, and Eric didn't understand much of it, but It sounded very grand. Finally, Eric was handed his Bachelor of Science degree. He gave the audience a smile and a wave and headed off the stage. It was not until he had sat down again that the applause finally died away and the ceremony could go on. After the ceremony, there was to be a church service at St. Giles Cathedral on High Street. Eric, turn the page, had expected to walk there like everyone else, but that didn't happen. As soon as Sir Alfred Ewing had thanked everyone for coming, Eric's fellow students surged toward Eric. Before he knew what was happening, Eric was hoisted onto a chair with poles nailed to either side of it so that it could be carried on shoulders of his fellow students. Soon the chair was lifted above the crowd, and Eric was carried from McEwen Hall down the steps and all the way to the cathedral. Eric was still wearing the wreath when the students finally deposited him on the front steps of the cathedral. Suddenly the crowd that had accompanied him from the university was silent. Eric realized that it was waiting for him to give a speech. In an instant, his mind flashed back to his fellow athletes who had tried their hardest for Great Britain, but had not come back from Paris as Olympic champions. As he thought about them, Eric remembered a quote he'd read somewhere. He repeated the quote for the crowd. In the dust of defeat, as well as the laurels of victory, there is glory to be found if one has done his best. Then he talked for a few minutes about what the words meant, reminding the crowd that they should all be proud of themselves when they know they've tried their hardest at something. This is very good advice. During the service in the cathedral, Eric sat quietly and listened to the sermon. He had hoped that things would have died down by the time the service was over, but the other students had an even bigger surprise for him. When the service was over, Eric was led down the aisle and through the double wooden doors. As he walked out into the sunlight, he saw a horse-drawn carriage waiting. Before he had time to realize what was happening, Eric found himself sitting inside the carriage next to Sir Alfred Ewing. The carriage pulled off and traveled along the Royal Mile and onto Prince's Street, Edinburgh's main street. All along the way, huge crowds had gathered to honor their local sports hero. Eric smiled and waved to them. Finally, the carriage stopped outside the Vice-Chancellor's home, and Eric was invited in for dinner. It had been a wonderful day, and Eric happily wrote and told his parents and Robert all about it. He wished they could have seen it for themselves. Since they hadn't, he sent them a pile of newspaper clippings about his achievements in Paris at the Olympic Games. The celebrations did not end in a single day, though for the next week, receptions and parties were held for Eric every day. Just when Eric thought he could take no more, it was time for him to climb aboard the train for a trip to London. There, at Stamford Bridge, he was to compete for the British Empire against the United States. It had been arranged before the Olympic Games started that the American team would stop off in London on its way home for the competition. As he rumbled along on the train towards London, Eric could hardly believe it had been only 8 days since the Olympic Games had ended. So much had happened to him in such a short time. Eric was to be the last man, the anchor, on the British Empire's 4x400 meter relay team. The anchor on the American team was none other than Horatio Fitch, whom Eric had beaten in the final of the 400-meter race in Paris. Everyone present for the competition wondered whether Eric could beat Fitch again. The people didn't have to wait long to find out. As the runners rounded the turn just before handing off their batons to the anchors, it was obvious that the United States should win the relay. As Eric Liddell reached back and grabbed the baton from the British teammate, he was a full 7 meters behind Horatio Fitch. Eric threw his head back and thrashed his arms back and forth and at his side in his odd running style. As he did so, he gathered speed. By the time he reached the first turn, Eric was gaining on Horatio Fitch. Down the back straight, he pulled even with him, But on the second turn, Horatio managed to hold off Eric's challenge and stay just in front, though not by much. But as they entered the home straight and headed for the finish line, Horatio Fitch had no answer for Eric's final burst of speed. Eric began to pull away and crossed the finish line 4 meters ahead of Horatio Fitch. The crowd went wild. By the time Eric got back to Scotland, everyone had heard about his latest victory. More people than ever wanted to hold parties in his honor. For the time being, he was Scotland's greatest sports star. A week after arriving back in Edinburgh, Eric was at yet another dinner in his honor. This time, he had invited his old coach, Tom McKercher, to attend with him. During his speech, Eric told the audience how much Tom McKercher had helped and encouraged him when he had been a green athlete fresh out of high school. When the speech was over, the crowd clapped and cheered. Tom McKercher stood and bowed and then sat down again. Everyone expected Eric to do the same, but as the applause died away, Eric continued to stand with a serious look on his face. The audience grew silent. Did Eric Liddell have something else to say? Eric cleared his throat and began softly. Before I sit down, there is one more thing I would like to tell you all. It has been a wonderful experience to compete in the Olympic Games and to bring home a gold medal. But since I have been a young lad, I have had my eyes on a different prize. You see, each one of us is in a greater race than any I have run in Paris, and this race ends when God gives out the medals. It has always been my intention to be a missionary, and I have just received word that I have been accepted as a chemistry teacher at the Anglo-Chinese College in Shenzhen, China. From now on, I will be putting my energy into preparing to take up that position. The room was completely silent. People stared at Eric with open mouths. The impact of what he had just said was slowly sinking in. Scotland's greatest athlete was giving up running to go to China. Within hours, every newspaper in the country would carry the stunning news. Eric was glad the news was finally out. Now everyone knew of his decision, and he could busy himself making plans to get to China. While he looked forward to teaching chemistry and being a coach at the college, more than just teaching and coaching students, Eric wanted to help them spiritually. But to be more effective doing that, he felt he needed some extra training. After communicating further with the Anglo-Chinese College in Shenzhen, it was decided that he should stay 1 more year in Scotland and study theology at the Congregational College in Edinburgh. Of course, study did not keep Eric, being who he was, busy all the time. Eric managed to fit in several extensive Christian speaking tours. During that year. He toured England several times, and everywhere he went, huge crowds turned out to hear him. He also traveled to Germany, where the British Army still occupied tracts of the Rhineland it had captured during World War I. Everything Eric did, whether taking part in charity run or playing a fun game of rugby, was written about in these papers. And following day, nothing about him seemed too trivial to report on. People all over Scotland seemed to want to read about everything Eric was up to. Elsa McKitchney was one such person. She was 14 years old. She was a 14-year-old girl who followed what Eric was doing with great interest. Every night, she would scour the newspapers to see if there was anything new to read about him. She would discuss all she found out about Eric with her friends at the George Watson Ladies' College in Edinburgh. Nearly all the girls at the school had the same interest in Eric as Elsa. He was, after all, a local hero, not to mention very charming young man. One day, Elsa McKitchney had an idea. Why not form an Eric Liddell fan club? She discussed the idea with her friends at school, and they all agreed it would be a great thing to do. Elsa quickly made up rules for the new club. To become a member, a person had to pass an oral exam about the life of Eric Liddell. Once a person passed the test, she was entitled to use 1 page of the club's scrapbook to write down a poem or some thoughts on Eric. In return, the members were each given a photo of Eric, which they promised to display in a place of honor. Elsa McKitchney wrote to Eric to tell him about the fan club and ask whether he would give his permission to make it an official Eric Liddell fan club. She even asked him to come to dinner at her house as soon as Eric got her letter. He wrote to Elsa giving her permission to run the one and only official Eric Liddell fan club and accepted her invitation to dinner. Elsa was too excited to say much during the meal, but she wanted everything Eric did she watched everything Eric did and tried to remember every word he said so that she could report to the other members of the club at a special meeting she had called for the following day. Why didn't she invite the rest of the fan club? Elsa. When Eric left the house after dinner, Elsa drained the rest of the tea from the cup he had been drinking from and dried the tea leaves left in the bottom. She tucked them inside an envelope. They became one of her most prized possessions. Such was the impression Eric Liddell left on young girls in Scotland. Time was passing quickly, though. Before Eric knew it, his year at the Congregational College was over, and he was packing for China. Newspapers counted down the weeks until July 13. One paper even printed a cartoon of Eric running in black shorts and clergyman's collar. Many people in Scotland understood why he was leaving, and they wanted to encourage him any way they could. Eric's last official running event was at the Scottish AAA Championships at Hampden Park, Glasgow. When people heard that Eric Liddell was entered in the 100, 220, and the 440-yard races, 12,000 spectators showed up to cheer him on. Eric thrilled his fans by winning all 3 races. Not only did Eric's admirers come to see him run one last time before he left Scotland, but enormous crowds came to hear him speak in churches. What about the fan club? Fan club didn't show up? Enormous crowds came to hear him speak in churches as well. As many as 1,000 people had to be turned away sometimes because there was no more room in the church where he was speaking. When the time came for him to leave, there was hardly a person in all Scotland who didn't know where Eric was going and why. Just as when he had returned from the Olympic Games in Paris, an endless round of luncheons and dinners were arranged for people to say goodbye to Eric, who graciously attended them all. Finally, Monday, July 13, 1925 arrived. At 5 p.m., Eric picked up his suitcases, looked around his room one last time. His friends had arranged for him to get to Waverley Rail Station, but they had given him no details about the arrangements. As Eric opened the door and stepped out into the warm evening, his mouth fell open in shock. In front of him was a carriage much like the one that had taken him from St. Giles Cathedral to the Vice-Chancellor's house for dinner a year ago. However, this carriage was different in one big way. Instead of being drawn by 2 horses like the previous carriage, this carriage was led by 2 teams of students and friends who held the shaft in their hands, ready to pull the carriage with Eric in it all the way to the station. Amid cheering and whistling, Eric climbed into the carriage and off the men trotted. The teams pulled the carriage up to Hope Terrace, along Clark Street and then Nicholson Street, over the bridge, and on to the station. All along the route, people had gathered to say farewell to Scotland's most famous and well-loved athlete. Some people even burst into tears as Eric passed by. Others waved and whistled loudly. Traffic ground to a halt as the crowd surged forward for one last glimpse of their hero. Drivers honked their car horns and counted themselves lucky to be caught in traffic jam caused by people wanting to honor Eric Liddell. Finally, the carriage arrived at the station, and Eric began a torturous round of goodbyes. No one was sure when they would see him again, and so many people wanted to shake his hand and wish him well that it was impossible to get to everyone. As the train puffed into the station, the crowd began to sing hymns, and Eric joined in with them. He was still singing as he climbed aboard and found himself a seat. He pulled the window open and began to wave to everyone as he waved goodbye to his friends and said goodbye to his life in Edinburgh. He knew he was saying goodbye to something else, too. From now on, he would no longer be living in a country where he was a national hero and recognized in every corner store. He was about to become a stranger in a strange and troubled land. But again, where was the fan club? Not a very good fan club or faithful fan club. Elsa! All right, to be continued.